Welcome to my channel.
Chain in Lochdubh was not merely water falling from the sky. It was a malicious, sentient entity with a personal grudge against anyone foolish enough to be outdoors. It didn't fall vertically. Driven by a biting wind straight off the Atlantic, it hosed horizontally, searching for the smallest gap in tweed or oilskin, stinging the eyes and plastering hair to the skull. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, currently the only representative of law and order in a 50-mile radius of Sutherland's most obstinate village, was observing this meteorological assault from the only sensible vantage point, the lounge bar of the Tommel Castle Hotel. He was not, technically, on duty. Nor was he, strictly speaking, off duty. Hamish existed in a permanent grey zone of semi-employment, a state he cultivated with the dedication of a Zen master. He was currently nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee that he had charmed out of Mr. Johnson, the hotel manager, by looking pathetically damp around the edges some 40 minutes prior. Hamish stretched his long legs toward the flickering peat fire, emitting a sigh that sounded like a deflating bagpipe. He was a tall, gangly man whose fiery red hair was currently subdued by the dampness into a russet mat. His hazel eyes, usually sharp with an intelligence he took great pains to hide, were currently glazed over in a fair approximation of bovine contentment. Beside his chair, Lugs, a small, peculiar dog of indeterminate lineage but undeniable loyalty, let out a snore that riffled the hearthrug. Another coffee, Hamish. Or are you planning to pay rent on that chair? Mr. Johnson, a man whose ulcer seemed to grow in direct correlation to the arrival of tourist season, wiped down the bar with aggressive snaps of his cloth. I would not want to put you to trouble, Mr. Johnson, Hamish said, his voice a soft Highland lilt that had lulled many a criminal into a false sense of security, though a wee drop of milk would not go amiss to warm this up. You'll warm it up by buying a fresh cup, Johnson grumbled, but he was already reaching for the pot. Hamish was like the damp rot in the skirting boards. You could complain about him, but he was inevitably part of the hotel's structure. The peace of the afternoon peace defined by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and the smell of wet wool and burning peat was shattered not by a bang, but by the screech of low-profile tires fighting a losing battle against Highland gravel. Hamish didn't move his head, but his eyes shifted toward the rain-streaked window. A vehicle had pulled up outside. It was low, sleek, and painted a shade of canary yellow so violent it seemed to vibrate against the relentless grey of the landscape. It was the sort of car that shouted, "Look at me, I have more money than sense," a sentiment that was immediately confirmed when the driver stepped out. He was a man perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in an outfit that someone in London had assured him was appropriate country wear. The tweed jacket was too green, the jodhpurs too tight, and the leather boots so highly polished they reflected the miserable sky. He had a mane of frosted blonde hair that the wind immediately whipped into a frenzy, and he was carrying a leather weekend bag that probably cost more than Hamish's police Land Rover. "Oh dear," Hamish murmured into his coffee cup, "a peacock in a poultry yard." The door to the hotel swung open with a crash, admitting a gust of freezing rain and the yellow-clad stranger. The man did not just enter a room. He arrived. He stopped dramatically on the threshold, shuddered theatrically, and brushed water from his shoulders with jerky, irritable movements. "Good God," the newcomer announced to the room at large, his voice a high-clipped English bray that set Hamish's teeth on edge. "It is absolutely biblical out there. Is this normal? Someone tell me this isn't normal." Mr. Johnson stiffened behind the bar. "It's October in Sutherland, sir. If it wasn't raining, we would worry the world had ended." The man stared at Johnson as if the hotelier were a talking turnip. He then swiveled his head, taking in the slightly shabby comfort of the lounge, his lip curling in distaste. His gaze swept over Hamish, dismissing him instantly as part of the rustic scenery, like a stag's head mounted on the wall, only less decorative. "I am Julian Vane," the man announced, dropping his expensive bag onto a settle with a thud that made Lugs jump awake with a sharp yip. "I have a reservation. The suite. And I'll need someone to deal with my car. It's filthy." The name hung in the air. Julian Vane. Hamish saw Mr. Johnson's eyebrows climb toward his receding hairline. Even Hamish, who considered television a noisy intrusion and rarely read anything beyond the local paper and food labels, knew the name. Julian Vane was a celebrity interior designer, a man famous for turning perfectly functional London townhouses into beige minimalist caves, usually while insulting the owners on camera for a Channel 4 reality show. "Mr. Vane," Johnson said, adopting the strained politeness he reserved for the truly difficult customers, "we don't have a suite, as such. We have the stag room, which is our largest double with a lock view. Twice he. Vane sighed, pulling off leather driving gloves finger by finger. And I'll need a stiff drink. Gin. Punky's 47 if you have it, though I doubt it. With a slice of grapefruit, not lemon. Do not bring me lemon. Hamish sank lower in his chair. He hated the Sassenachs who came up here treating the Highlands like a theme park built for their amusement, but he particularly hated the ones who arrived with a pre-packaged set of grievances. This one reeked of trouble. He reeked of high demands, short tempers, and the kind of oblivious arrogance that upset the delicate social ecosystem of Lochdubh. As Johnson scurried off to locate gin that met the specifications, Vane began pacing the room, pulling out a sleek smartphone and holding it aloft, frowning. No signal, Vane barked. How can there be no signal in the 21st century? I need to upload a story. My followers need to see this quaintness. He gestured vaguely at a framed print of a Highland cow on the wall, as if it were a fungal growth. Hamish took a slow slurp of his coffee. He could feel the comforting blanket of his idleness beginning to fray. Men like Julian Vane didn't just bring yellow cars and loud voices to Lochdubh, they brought disruption. They brought things they didn't understand, insulted people they deemed inferiors, and inevitably wanted the police to fix things when reality failed to bend to their whims. Hamish closed his eyes, willing the man to disappear, willing the rain to stop, willing the universe to let him finish his coffee in peace. But deep down in his gut, beneath the layers of caffeine and the remnants of a lunchtime mutton pie, Hamish Macbeth felt the cold, hard nudge of premonition. Peacock had landed, and it was only a matter of time before the foxes noticed. Vane's arrival didn't just ruffle feathers, it plucked them. By the time Hamish retreated to his small police station and the company of his stove, the village gossip network was already humming like a high-tension wire. The designer had apparently insulted the hotel's upholstery, suggested the minister's wife should consider a more muted palette for her floral arrangements, and nearly run over Archie McLean's prize sheep while trying to find a spot with 5 bars of 5G. The next morning dawned with a deceptive pale light that suggested the rain might take a brief intermission. Though the clouds remained a bruised purple over the peaks of Sulvan, Hamish was in the middle of a very delicate operation involving a frying pan and 2 eggs he had acquired from a neighbour in exchange for not noticing a small, unauthorized extension on a potting shed. He was just reaching for the salt when the telephone on his desk let out a shrill, demanding ring that sounded like a personal insult. "Och, ignore it, lugs," Hamish muttered, staring at the egg yolks. "It'll just be Mrs. Gillespie complaining about the Curry's cat again." The phone rang again, and a third time. With a groan of genuine physical pain, Hamish wiped his hands on his trousers and picked up the receiver. It was Mr. Johnson from the hotel, and he sounded as though he were undergoing a major medical procedure without anesthesia. "Macbeth? You better get down to the village green," Johnson gasped. "That's Vanefellow, the designer. He's not moving. And he's upside down." Hamish sighed, the vision of his perfect breakfast evaporating like mist on the loch. He pulled on his boots, threw his yellow oilskin over his lanky frame, and whistled for lugs. As he walked down the Bree, he could see a small, hushed crowd gathered near the old stone fountain of Victorian monstrosity that the village was secretly proud of. There, draped over the stone lip of the fountain like a discarded piece of bright yellow confetti, was Julian Vane. He was indeed upside down, his expensive boots pointing toward the grey sky and his frosted blonde hair trailing in the stagnant water. But it wasn't just the position that was bizarre. Someone had taken several rolls of his own designer wallpaper, hideous, shimmering gold pattern head bragged about in the bar, and wrapped him in it like a grotesque mummy. A small, elegant tag had been pinned to his chest. It read, "Needs more texture." Hamish stood at the edge of the fountain, his hands deep in his pockets. The peacock looked significantly less majestic when soaking wet and gift wrapped in metallic paper. The air was thick with the smell of wet paper and the sharp, metallic tang of death. Hamish noted the way the body was positioned. It was a heavy job, moving a man of Vane's size into such a precarious spot. "Well now," Hamish said softly, his eyes scanning the surrounding cobblestones for footprints that the morning drizzle hadn't yet erased. "That's a terrible waste of wallpaper." Behind him, the village postmistress, Mrs. Kennedy, crossed herself. "It's a judgment, Hamish. The man was a blasphemer. He told me my shop front was aggressively beige." Hamish didn't answer. He was looking at the way Vane's neck was twisted, and the strange, purplish bruise visible just above the collar of the expensive tweed jacket. This wasn't a prank gone wrong. It was a calculated piece of theatre. Theatre in Lochdubh, usually meant a long, exhausting investigation that would involve paperwork, questions from superiors, and worst of all, the arrival of the Strathbane CID. Lugs, Hamish whispered to the dog, who was sniffing tentatively at the yellow car parked nearby. I think our quiet winter has just been cancelled. He reached out a long, careful finger and touched the gold wallpaper. It was high-end, heavy-duty stuff. Not the kind of thing you found in the local hardware store. Vane had brought his own tools for his own destruction. As Hamish straightened up, he heard the distant, discordant wail of a siren echoing through the glen. It was too early for the Strathbane police, which meant someone had called them before they were even called the local constable. Hamish's heart sank. That meant only one thing. DC Vice Blair was likely already on his way, and he would be in a foul mood. Hamish looked at the body again, squinting. There was something missing. Vane had been wearing a very large, very ugly diamond pinky ring in the hotel the night before. The hand dangling in the fountain water was now bare, the skin pale and wrinkled from the cold. The crime was messy, theatrical, and pointed. It was the sort of murder that screamed for attention, which was the one thing Hamish Macbeth spent his entire life trying to avoid. He stood there, looking unkempt and mildly confused to any onlooker. But his mind was already cataloguing the residents of the Tommel Castle Hotel and the villagers who had been beautified by Vane's tongue the previous evening. The piece of Lochdubh hadn't just been shattered, it had been gift-wrapped and drowned. The siren grew louder, a piercing scream that tore through the Highlands silence. Hamish adjusted his cap and prepared his simple village copper face. The play had begun, and he was the only one who realized the lead actor had been murdered before the first act was even over. The piercing wail of the sirens culminated in a screech of tires as two white and blue patrol cars from Strathbane skidded onto the damp gravel of the village square, nearly clipping Vane's yellow Lamborghini in their haste. Out of the lead car exploded Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose face was a permanent shade of overboiled beetroot and whose blood pressure was a matter of regional concern. He slammed the door with a force that made the mountain peaks tremble and marched toward the fountain, his heavy shoes splashing through puddles with zero regard for the integrity of any potential footprints. Macbeth, Blair's voice was a jagged rasp that could have stripped paint from a boat. You great, ginger streak of Highland misery. I might have known if there was a high-profile corpse in the water, you'd be standing over it looking like you're waiting for a bus. Hamish touched the brim of his cap, his expression settling into a look of vacant, wide-eyed helpfulness. Good morning to you, Inspector. It's a grand day for a murder, is it not? Though the rain is a bit heavy for the paperwork. Blair didn't even look at him. He pushed past the small crowd, shoved Mr. Johnson aside, and stared down at the golden-wrapped bundle in the fountain. He let out a sharp, barking laugh. Wallpapered? The locals finally got sick of his poncy English ways, did they? It's a clear-cut case of Highland thuggery. Probably a dispute over a bill or a drunken brawl that went too far. He was wrapped very neatly, sir, Hamish offered softly, shifting his weight. And the note needs more texture. It suggests a certain artistic flair. And I couldn't help but notice his diamond ring is gone. A very large stone it was, too. Of course it's gone, Blair snapped, turning his bulbous nose toward Hamish. Robbery and homicide. Simple. But you wouldn't know simple if it bit you on your lazy backside. You're too busy poaching salmon and drinking tea to see what's right in front of your face. It's obviously one of these smelly crofters. Who's the biggest troublemaker in this godforsaken hole? Blair's eyes swept the crowd and landed on Archie McLean, who was still wearing his muck-stained overalls and holding a shepherd's crook. Archie, whose temper was as short as his stature, glared back. You there, McLean, Blair shouted, pointing a thick finger. I heard you had a run-in with the deceased's car yesterday. Threatening a visitor, were we? Decided to wrap him up like a Christmas present when he wouldn't pay for a dead sheep. I did no such thing, Archie yelled back, his face turning a shade that rivaled Blair's. The man was a menace. He nearly sent my best ewe into the loch, but I would not waste good wallpaper on the likes of him. Take him in, Blair barked to his subordinates, Detectives Anderson and McLean, no relation to Archie, who were already unloading forensic kits with practiced boredom. Interrogate him. Use the firm approach. I want a confession by lunchtime so I can get back to Strathbane and away from this smell of wet wool and stupidity. Hamish watched as Archie was led away, protesting loudly in Gaelic. He knew Archie hadn't done it. The man didn't have the patience for wallpapering, let alone the delicate touch required to pin a note without tearing the paper. Hamish caught the eye of Priscilla Halberton-Smythe, who had just appeared on the edge of the square, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the drizzle. She gave a small, perceptive shake of her head. Blair was already barking orders into a radio, dismissing Hamish with a flick of his hand as if he were a persistent fly. Macbeth, go stand by the road and direct traffic. Keep the rubberneckers away. And don't you dare touch anything. I'm in charge here, and I'm going to wrap this case up before you've even finished your morning porridge. Hamish nodded obediently, his face a mask of humble compliance. As you say, Inspector, I'll just be out of your way then. Directing the traffic. It's a very important job, to be sure. As Blair stomped off toward the hotel to begin his official bullying, Hamish whistled low for lugs. He had no intention of standing by the road all morning. Blair was looking for a brute with a grudge, but Hamish had seen the way the wallpaper was cut straight, clean lines, despite the rain. This wasn't the work of a disgruntled crofter, it was the work of someone who understood aesthetics. Hamish turned his back on the scene at the fountain, where DC Furs Blair was still screaming like a foghorn. To any onlooker, the village constable appeared to be drifting aimlessly, perhaps stunned by the discovery. In reality, Hamish was employing his most effective investigative technique, the slow, methodical stroll. With lugs trotting at his heels, his ears flattened against the Highland drizzle, Hamish headed toward the small shops that formed the backbone of Lochdubh's social life. He knew that while Blair was busy frightening the locals into silence, the real truth was being chewed over along with morning rolls and lukewarm tea. The village documented every foreign body like vein with surgical precision. His first stop was the Lochdubh curry house. The scent of turmeric and cumin acted as a warm blanket against the biting chill, but today, the air inside was thick with a pungent tension. Mr. Patel, who had spent 20 years trying to convince the Highlanders that garlic was not malevolent witchcraft, was leaning over his formica counter. His eyes were wide behind thick spectacles. A terrible business, Hamish, Patel whispered, sliding a steaming mug of tea across the counter before Hamish could ask. The man was a creature of pure malice. He came in here yesterday evening, stared at my wallpaper, the Crimson Flock, and told me it looked like a slaughterhouse for Muppets. What does that even mean, Hamish? I worked so hard on this aesthetic. Hamish took a long, appreciative sip, the heat radiating through his damp chest. It means he had more opinions than friends, Mr. Patel. He was a man who sharpened his tongue on everyone. Did he have anyone with him? Or was he sharing his misery with the world at large? Patel shook his head, his hands busy polishing a jar of mango chutney. He was alone when he arrived, but he was not alone when he left. A woman, Hamish. Not a local. She was dressed in a long black designer coat that cost more than crofting subsidies, they argued. Not a screaming argument, but the quiet, poisonous kind where the words are like silver needles. She mentioned a binding contract and the final payment. Then they left together in that yellow car, splashing mud all over my windows. Hamish nodded slowly, his mind filing the woman in black under the mental tab of people Blair will ignore. He thanked Patel and moved on to the post office, where Mrs. Kennedy was holding court with her usual presence. The shop was crowded with villagers ostensibly buying stamps, but in reality, they were waiting for the latest update on the wallpaper murder. He's in a better place now. Hamish, Mrs. Kennedy announced, her voice booming with the authority of someone who handled everyone's private correspondence. Though I doubt the Golden Gates are up to his decorative standards. He'll be wanting to repaint the pearly gates in muted eggshell before the week is out. He was a difficult soul, Hamish agreed, leaning his lanky frame against the counter. Did he receive any mail during his stay, Mrs. Kennedy? Or perhaps send something out? He seemed a man with a great deal on his mind. Mrs. Kennedy peered over her glasses. He sent a registered letter yesterday afternoon to a firm of solicitors in London. Very agitated he was, too. Kept checking his watch and muttering about insurance and legacy. And he bought 3 rolls of tape, the heavy-duty, industrial kind. Not for a birthday parcel. Hamish felt a prickle of interest. Tape, you say? Not wallpaper? No, just tape. He said the wallpaper was in his trunk, a special commissioned piece for a client who didn't appreciate his genius. I thought it was just the rambling talk of a man who had too much gin and not enough fresh air. Hamish sighed, patting Lug's head. The pieces were starting to drift into view, though they didn't yet form a coherent picture. A woman in black, a solicitor's letter, a missing diamond ring, and a man wrapped in his own artistic failure. He stepped back into the rain, his yellow oilskin flapping. He saw Priscilla Halberton-Smythe's Range Rover idling near the hotel. She waved him over, her face serious. Hamish, she said as he leaned against her window, the scent of expensive perfume a contrast to wet dog. I heard Blair has arrested Archie. It's absolutely ridiculous. Archie couldn't wrap a ham sandwich, let alone a human being. I know that, Priscilla, Hamish said, his voice low and weary. But Blair needs a victim, and Archie is the loudest target. Tell me, did you see anyone unusual at the hotel last night? A woman in a black coat. Someone who looked like she'd rather be in Mayfair. Priscilla frowned, her grey eyes searching her memory. There was a woman. She arrived late, in a hired car. She didn't check in under her own name. I saw her talking to Vane by the fire. She looked terrified, Hamish. Not of him, but for him. Like she was watching a man walk off a cliff, and knew she couldn't stop him. Hamish looked toward the fountain where the forensic team was finally lifting the body. The gold wallpaper shimmered in the gloom, a bright, ugly scar on the landscape. He lived to offend, Hamish mused, but someone went to great trouble to make sure his death was as theatrical as his life. It wasn't just murder, it was a critique. He knew he should be directing traffic, but there were more questions. He needed to find the source of that wallpaper and the identity of the woman. As he walked away, he noticed a wet scrap of paper caught in the thorns of a gorse bush. He picked it up carefully. It was a receipt from a hardware store in Strathbane, dated 2 days ago, for industrial-grade shears and gold-leaf adhesive. "Och, lugs," Hamish whispered, tucking the receipt into his pocket. It seems our designer was preparing his own shroud long before he arrived in Lochdubh. The question is, who helped him put it on, and why did they pin a note to the result? The investigation was no longer village gossip, it was a trail leading into the shadows of a planned execution. Hamish looked at the mountains, the mist swirling around the peaks like a secret. Blair was barking at a brick wall, but Hamish was beginning to hear the whispers under the wind. He needed one more piece of the puzzle, and he knew where to find it. The hotel's refuse bins. If Vane had been disposing of his failures, that's where the evidence would be rotting. He would have to be careful. Blair's men were everywhere, and the last thing Hamish wanted was to be caught doing actual police work when he was supposed to be standing uselessly by the road. He moved toward the back of the hotel, keeping to the shadows of the stone walls, his mind racing faster than he would ever let his feet go. The game was afoot, and the Highlands provided the stage for a very modern tragedy. The scent of rotting vegetable peelings and stale beer wasn't exactly the most romantic backdrop for a morning walk, but for Hamish Macbeth, the back alley of the Tommel Castle Hotel was currently more attractive than the most scenic glen in Scotland. He kept low, his long, gangly frame casting a shadow against the damp stone walls, while Lugs followed with a disgruntled expression that suggested he would much rather be back by the fire than investigating the dregs of a celebrity's lifestyle. In the distance, the muffled roar of DC the First echoed around the front of the building, a sound like a distant, angry sea lion. Hamish knew he had limited time before one of Blair's eager young constables wandered back here to escape the boss's wrath, so he approached the large metal industrial bins with a sense of urgent, yet lazy, purpose. He began to pick through the topmost layers of rubbish with a discarded stick, avoiding a particularly soggy pile of coffee grounds. His persistence was rewarded when his stick caught on a scrap of shimmering gold material. He pulled it out, finding it wasn't just wallpaper, but a crumpled, high-quality brochure for an art gallery in London. On the back, in a frantic, sharp hand, someone had scrawled a series of numbers and a name. Vera, this must be the woman in black, Hamish thought, his hazel eyes narrowing as he tucked the paper into his pocket. He was about to dive deeper into the refuse, when a crisp, clear voice made him jump nearly out of his skin. "Really, Hamish? I knew things were tight at the police station, but I didn't think you'd resorted to scavenging for your supper." Hamish straightened up, his face flushing a shade of red that almost matched his hair. Standing at the corner of the hotel was Elspeth Grant, the local reporter for the Highland News. She was dressed in a practical, yet stylish, red raincoat, her dark eyes sparkling with a mixture of amusement and professional curiosity. Elspeth was a woman who knew exactly how to ruffle Hamish's composure, and her presence usually meant that the village gossip was about to be printed in black and white. "Auk. Elspeth, you gave me a fright," Hamish said, attempting to smooth down his rumpled uniform. "I'm just conducting a preliminary assessment of the environmental impact of the hotel's waste management. It's a new directive from the Strathbane office." Elspeth laughed, a bright sound that echoed off the stone. "And I am the Queen of Sheba. You're looking for clues, Hamish, because you know Blair is currently busy arresting the most innocent man in the county. Poor Archie McLean is being interrogated as if he's the mastermind of a global crime syndicate, while you're out here playing in the bins. What have you found?" "Nothing that would interest a big city journalist like yourself," Hamish countered. though he couldn't help but admire the way her hair curled in the Highland mist. Before Elspeth could press him further, a second figure emerged from the hotel's rear entrance. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe looked every inch the aristocrat, even in her casual walking gear. Her presence immediately shifted the atmosphere, creating a triangular tension that Hamish found more difficult to navigate than a peat bog in the dark. "Is everything all right here?" Priscilla asked, her gaze drifting from Hamish's messy hands to Elspeth's challenging stance. "I saw you from the window, Hamish. I thought you might need some help. My father is quite upset about the police presence, he says. It's bad for the hotel's reputation to have guests wrapped in wallpaper on the lawn. It's the fountain, actually," Elspeth corrected sharply. "And I'm sure the reputation will recover once the truth comes out. Hamish was just telling me about his environmental assessment." Priscilla ignored the jab, turning her attention back to Hamish. "I've been thinking about that woman I saw, Hamish. She wasn't a guest, but she had a key. I saw her letting herself into the side entrance near the kitchens last night. If she's the Vera you're looking for, she might still be in the village. Nobody leaves Lochdubh in this weather without being noticed by at least 6 different sets of curtains." Hamish felt the familiar weight of his complicated feelings for both women. Priscilla represented a world of elegance and stability that he often felt drawn to. Yet her social standing was a barrier he was not sure he ever wanted to cross. Elspeth, on the other hand, was sharp, grounded, and shared his deep love for the Highlands, even if she did insist on making his life difficult for the sake of a headline. "A key, you say?" Hamish mused, ignoring the silent battle of looks between the two women. If she had a key, she had an accomplice inside the hotel. Mr. Johnson wouldn't give a key to just anyone, not with the prices he charges for the rooms. "The staff were all terrified of Vane," Elspeth added, pulling out her notebook. "Head spent the last 48 hours insulting everyone from the chef to the chambermaid. He told the girl who cleans the rooms that her uniform was an affront to the very concept of textiles. The girl was in tears. Hamish, people in this village have long memories and short tempers when it comes to outsiders who think they can walk all over us." Hamish nodded, his mind working through the social dynamics of the hotel. He looked from Priscilla to Elspeth, feeling like a man trapped between a rock and a hard place. "I need to speak with the kitchen staff," he said, moving to push past them. "And Priscilla, if you could keep an eye on your father's guest list, I would be much obliged. Elspeth, if you print a single word of this before I've had my breakfast, I'll have you cited for obstructing a police officer." "You haven't had breakfast yet?" Priscilla asked, her voice softening with genuine concern. "Come into the kitchen, Hamish. I'll have Mrs. Wellington make you a bacon roll. You can talk to the staff while you eat. It's better than digging through the rubbish." Elspeth smiled thinly. "A bacon roll and a private audience. You certainly have a way with the local authorities, Priscilla. Just don't forget, Hamish, that the woman in black was seen heading toward the old croft near the bridge. My sources tell me there was smoke coming from the chimney this morning, and that place hasn't been inhabited since the Macri sisters moved to the home in Laireg." Hamish felt a jolt of excitement. The old croft was a perfect hiding spot, secluded, yet close enough to keep an eye on the village. He realized that while Blair was shouting at the front door and the ladies were competing for his attention at the back, the killer was likely sitting by a fire, waiting for the storm to pass. He thanked them both with a hurried tip of his cap, his lazy demeanor discarded for a moment of sharp focus. He had the name Vera, a potential accomplice in the hotel, and a location. Now, he just had to find a way to investigate without DCY Blair, noticing that his useless peasant was actually 3 steps ahead of the entire Strathbane CYD. He whistled for Lugs, who followed him with renewed vigor, sensing that the hunt was finally beginning in earnest. As he walked toward the kitchen, Hamish couldn't help but feel that the golden wallpaper was just the shiny surface of a very dark and very dirty secret. The warmth of the Tommel Castle Hotel kitchen was a sensory assault of the best kind, smelling of toasted flour, sizzling fat, and the faint underlying scent of lemon polish. Mrs. Wellington, a woman whose culinary prowess was matched only by her refusal to be intimidated by anyone under the rank of a duke, handed Hamish a bacon roll wrapped in a napkin with the solemnity of a priest, delivering a blessing. Hamish took a large, ungraceful bite, the salt and grease providing a momentary shield against the grim reality of the fountain outside. Lugs sat at his feet, his tail thumping rhythmically against the stone flags, waiting for the inevitable piece of rind that would fall his way. Hamish leaned against a heavy oak table, watching the kitchen staff. They were moving with a frantic, jittery energy, their eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting Julian Vane's ghost to appear and critique their plaiting. "It's a black day, Hamish," Mrs. Wellington said, wiping her hands on her apron. But I'll tell you this, not a soul in this kitchen is shedding a tear for that man. He walked in here yesterday afternoon and told my pastry chef that his eclairs looked like depressed sausages. The poor lad has been shaking ever since. But even so, no one here has the stomach for wrapping a man in paper like a piece of cheap fish. It's unnatural. Hamish chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on a set of heavy-duty kitchen shears hanging on the wall. They were spotless, gleaming with a fresh coat of oil. "Those shears there, Mrs. Wellington," he said, pointing with his roll. "Have they been in their place all morning?" I noticed the wallpaper on the deceased was cut with a very steady hand, almost professional. Mrs. Wellington frowned, stepping closer to the tool rack. "Now that you mention it, they were missing yesterday evening. I thought Mary had taken them to the herb garden, but she said she hadn't seen them. They appeared back on the hook this morning, clean as a whistle. I didn't think twice about it, what with all the commotion at the fountain." Hamish's mind clicked into gear. An outsider wouldn't know where the kitchen shears were kept, nor would they take the time to clean them and return them to the exact hook. This pointed to someone who knew the hotel's rhythm, someone who could move through the back corridors without raising an alarm. But Blair was not interested in the nuances of kitchen inventory. Just as Hamish was about to ask about the woman in black again, the swinging doors to the kitchen burst open with a violence that sent a stack of metal cooling racks clattering to the floor. GCI Blair marched in, followed by Detective Anderson, who was dragging a handcuffed and mud-spattered Archie McLean. Archie looked less like a murderer and more like a man who had been through a particularly aggressive car wash. His eyes were wild with indignation, and his breathing was ragged. "There!" Blair bellowed, his face a triumphant shade of violet. "The search is over. We found this specimen hiding in his shed, trying to scrub the smell of gold adhesive off his hands. He's as guilty as a fox in a henhouse, and I'm taking him through to Strathbane to start the formal processing. Move out of the way, Macbeth, before I charge you with being an accessory to stupidity." Hamish didn't move. He swallowed the last of his bacon roll and stood up, his height suddenly making the kitchen feel much smaller. "Inspector," he said, his voice soft and infuriatingly calm, "I couldn't help but notice you've got the poor man in cuffs, but there's a small problem with your theory, if you'll pardon the intrusion of a simple village constable." Blair stopped, his chest heaving. "Problem? What problem?" He had the motor vehicle incident, and he was found with adhesive on his hands. "It's an open and shut case. Even you should be able to see that, you great ginger oaf." "Och, it's the adhesive, you see," Hamish said, stepping toward Archie. He gently took Archie's right hand and held it up for Blair to see. The hand was gnarled, the fingers bent at awkward angles, the knuckles swollen and red. "Archie here has had the severe arthritis since the winter of '98. He can barely hold a crook, let alone operate heavy-duty shears to cut thick, designer wallpaper into perfect, straight lines. And as for the adhesive, that's not gold leaf glue, Inspector. Pellanellin and Hoove salve. Archie was treating his ewes this morning, the ones Mr. Vane nearly ran over." Blair stared at Archie's hand, his mouth working silently like a landed fish. The contrast between the delicate, surgical precision of the wallpapering and Archie's crippled fingers was undeniable. "Furthermore," Hamish continued, his eyes glancing back at the shears on the wall, "the person who killed Mr. Vane used the hotel's own kitchen shears. They took them yesterday evening and returned them this morning, cleaned. Now, Archie might be many things, but he's not a man who sneaks into hotel kitchens to tidy up the cutlery. He hasn't set foot in this building since the New Year's dance of 2012, mostly because Mr. Johnson won't let him in with his boots on." The silence in the kitchen was absolute, broken only by the bubbling of a pot of soup. Blair's face transitioned from violet to a sickly pale grey, then back to a dangerous, mottled red. He looked at Archie, then at Hamish, his eyes burning with a hatred that promised a very long and very difficult winter for the Lochdubh police station. "Anderson, get these cuffs off him," Blair screamed, spinning on his heel. "Macbeth, you think you're so clever, don't you? If it wasn't the local idiot, then it's someone else in this village, and I'll find them. I don't need your nursery school observations. And you," he pointed at Archie, "get out before I arrest you for smelling like a sheep. It's a crime against my nostrils." Archie was released, muttering a string of Gaelic curses that were probably better left untranslated. He gave Hamish a brief, grateful nod before scurrying out the back door. Blair stormed out through the swinging doors, his temper far from extinguished. Hamish watched him go, feeling a weary sense of satisfaction. The red herring had been cleared, but the real killer was still at large, and they were far more dangerous than a disgruntled shepherd. Hamish turned back to Mrs. Wellington. "About that woman, Vera," he said, his mind already moving toward the old croft by the bridge. Did she have anything to do with the wallpapering? Or was she just the audience for the final show? Mrs. Wellington looked at the shears, then back at Hamish. I don't know about wallpaper, Hamish, but I know that when she left last night, she wasn't carrying a bag, and when she arrived, she was. A long, thin bag. The kind you'd use for carrying rolls of something. Hamish whistled for lugs. The red herring was gone, the stage was clear, and the woman in black was waiting in the shadows of the Highland mist. He had to reach the croft before Blair's rage led him to burn down the wrong house in search of a suspect. The investigation was narrowing, and the air was beginning to smell less like bacon and more like a trap. Hamish stepped out of the kitchen, the cold air hitting him like a physical blow. The rain had slowed to a fine, mizzling spray that clung to his eyelashes. He looked toward the mountains, their peaks hidden in a thick white shroud of clouds. The village felt claustrophobic today, the weight of the murder pressing down on the narrow streets and stone houses. He thought of Julian Vane, a man who had spent his life creating beauty in cold, sterile spaces, only to end up as a piece of performance art in a Highland fountain. There was a poetic justice to it that Hamish didn't like. It suggested a killer who wasn't just angry, but one who felt they were making a point. As he began the long walk toward the bridge, the sound of his own footsteps on the wet gravel seemed to echo the ticking of the clock in the hotel lobby. Time was running out, not just for the investigation, but for the woman named Vera. If she was the killer, she was waiting. If she was the next victim, he was already too late. Lugs trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, the only creature in Lochdubh who seemed to know exactly where he was going. Hamish followed, his hand resting on the heavy receipt in his pocket. The gold leaf adhesive, a silent witness to a crime that was far from finished. The Highlands held many secrets, but Hamish Macbeth was determined to drag this one into the light, even if it meant ruin for his quiet life. Hamish Macbeth stepped out of the back of the Tommel Castle Hotel, the heavy scent of bacon and damp wool lingering in his nostrils as the biting Highland wind reclaimed him. The rain had settled into a fine, persistent haar that clung to his red hair and turned the distant peaks into ghosts of grey granite. Lugs followed, his tail tucked low, his paws splashing rhythmically in the widening puddles. They walked away from the village square, where the yellow Lamborghini sat like a garish monument to a dead man's vanity, and headed toward the old stone bridge that spanned the rushing, peat-stained waters of the river. Beyond the bridge lay the croft Elspeth had mentioned, a derelict structure that had long been a refuge for stray sheep and the occasional wanderer. But today it held a secret that the formal investigation, led by the blustering DC First Blair, was completely oblivious to. Hamish's mind was a sieve, catching the small, seemingly insignificant details that Blair had stepped over in his polished shoes. The wallpaper, the industrial shears, the missing ring, and the woman named Vera. To Blair, it was a simple robbery or a drunken brawl. To Hamish, it was a piece of theatre, a meticulously staged critique of a man who had made a living by judging others. As he approached the croft, the smell of wood smoke reached him, sweet and acrid against the cold air. He slowed his pace, his long legs moving with a deceptive laziness, while his eyes scanned the perimeter for any sign of a trap. Lugs gave a low, questioning growl, his ears pricked forward. Hamish patted the dog's head, a silent signal for caution, and stepped toward the heavy, rotting wooden door that hung askew on its rusted hinges. "Police!" Hamish said softly, his voice barely rising above the sound of the wind. "I'm coming in now, so there's no need for any sudden movements." He pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the heat from a small, guttering fire in the hearth. A woman sat on a crate by the flames, huddled in a long, black designer coat that looked absurdly out of place in the squalor of the croft. She was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, and she was clutching a silver flask with trembling hands. This was the Vera they had seen, the woman in black, who had arrived like a shadow and remained on the periphery of Julian Vane's brief, loud stay in Lochdubh. She didn't look like a killer. She looked like someone who had just watched the world end and was waiting for the debris to finish falling. "You're Macbeth," she said, her voice a fragile rasp. "Julian said you were a fool. He said everyone in this village was a rustic cliché designed for his amusement. He didn't think anyone here was capable of seeing through him, let alone doing that to him." Hamish moved closer to the fire, the heat prickling his skin. "People in Lochdubh see a great deal more than they let on, Miss Vera, and Julian Vane was a man who went out of his way to be noticed." "Why are you here?" "And why were you arguing with him about a binding contract and a final payment? It seems a strange thing to discuss in a Highland curry shop." Vera let out a hollow laugh that turned into a cough. Contract? He was a thief, constable. A beautiful, charming, utterly soulless thief. Every design that made him famous, every visionary concept he sold to the London elite, was stolen. He found young, talented designers who were struggling, bought their silence with a pittance, and then discarded them when he drained them of their ideas. That gold wallpaper he was so proud of, that was his latest acquisition. It was designed by a girl from this very glen, a girl named Morag MacLean, who went to London with a dream and came back in a coffin 3 years ago, because Julian Vane convinced the world her work was his own. Hamish felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Morag MacLean. He remembered the girl bright, artistic, and fragile as a bird. Her father, Archie, had never been the same since she died, though the official report said it was a tragic accident, a fall from a balcony in Chelsea. Archie didn't do this, Hamish said, his voice firm. I have seen his hands. He couldn't have cut that paper. I know he didn't, Vera whispered, staring into the dying embers. But someone did. Someone who knew the truth. Julian wasn't here to relax, he was here to curate a new collection by raiding Morag's childhood sketches, which her father had kept in a trunk. He offered Archie money, a insulting amount, to buy the rights to her remaining work. She wanted to own her, even in death. He was going to announce the MacLean collection as his own tribute to the wild Highlands. It was the final insult, the ultimate theft. He had a meeting last night with the person who was supposed to sign over the final permissions. I tried to stop him. I told him he was playing with fire, that these people aren't like the ones in London. They don't sue you. They remember you. Hamish realized then that the motive wasn't money or a missing diamond ring. It was something far more potent, the defense of a legacy and the punishment of a fraud. The diamond ring hadn't been stolen. It had probably been taken as a symbol of the wealth Vane had built on the backs of others. The crime wasn't about what Vane had done in Lochdubh, but what he represented. The arrogant outsider who thought he could buy the soul of the village. The note pinned to his chest, "Needs more texture," was not a critique of the wallpaper, but a critique of Vane himself, a man who was all surface and no substance. A man who needed more human texture than he possessed. Who was the meeting with, Vera? Hamish asked, his hazel eyes fixed on her face. Who was the person he was meeting to finalize the theft of Morag's memory? Vera looked up, her expression a mask of pure terror. I don't know their name. He wouldn't tell me. He just said it was someone who understood the value of silence. But I saw them, constable. Just a glimpse through the window of the hotel before he left. It wasn't a crofter. It was someone who belonged there. Someone who had the keys to the kingdom and the shears to match. Hamish stood up, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The motive was clear now. Crime of restoration, a way to stop a predator from devouring the last remains of a local girl's talent. The killer was someone who had loved Morag, or perhaps someone who couldn't stand to see a parasite win. And as Hamish thought back to the hotel kitchen, the clean shears, and the way the wallpaper had been wrapped with such domestic, almost maternal care, a name began to form in his mind. It was a name that would shock the village, a name that would make DC Farr's Claire's head explode with rage. But more importantly, it was a name that fit the quiet, simmering darkness of the Highlands. Stay here, Vera, Hamish said, moving toward the door. Lugs and I have one more stop to make, and this time I won't be looking for a thief. I'll be looking for a gardener who knows how to prune the weeds. He stepped out into the mist, the cold air filling his lungs. The motive was petty to a man like Blair, who only understood power and greed, but to Hamish, it was as solid as the mountains. It was about respect, memory, and the fact that in Lochdubh, some things simply aren't for sale. He walked back toward the bridge, his mind already setting the trap, knowing that the killer was watching him, waiting to see if the lazy policeman would finally see the pattern in the gold. The sun was beginning to set, a pale, sickly yellow behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the glen. Hamish Macbeth walked with purpose now, the weight of the truth sitting heavy in his pocket alongside the receipt for the gold leaf adhesive. The final act was approaching, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of Lochdubh's peace. He had to be careful. A killer who acts out of love is often the most dangerous kind of all. Hamish knew that the village would soon be buzzing with the news of Vane's past, and the sympathy for the victim would evaporate faster than the morning dew. But the law was the law, even if the victim deserved his fate. He had to find the one who had taken the shears, the one who had wrapped the peacock in his own stolen feathers, and he had to do it before DCI Blair made a mess of the truth. The Highlands were silent, the only sound the rushing river, but Hamish could hear the whispers of the dead girl. Morag, calling for justice from the London shadows. He would give it to her, but in his own way, the Highland way, where silence is often the best kept secret of all. As he reached the village, the lights of the hotel flickered through the hair, a beacon of civilization in a landscape that remained stubbornly wild and unforgiving to those who did not belong. The path back to the village felt longer than the way out, the mud pulling at Hamish's boots as if the very land wanted to slow him down. He thought about the shears again and the person who had returned them so neatly. It wasn't an act of arrogance, it was an act of habit. The habit of someone who had spent their life cleaning up after others, making sure things were in their proper place, and ensuring that the surfaces were polished even when the foundations were rotting. It was the habit of a person who saw a human mess, like Julian Vane, and decided that the only solution was to wrap it up and put it away. Hamish's heart felt heavy. He didn't like being the one to tear down the people who did the real work of the village. But the gold wallpaper was a lie that couldn't be allowed to stand. He reached the edge of the square, seeing Blair's car still parked there, a symbol of the clumsy authority that would never understand the depths of Highland loyalty. Hamish took a deep breath, patted lugs once more, and headed toward the hotel's side entrance. The truth was waiting inside, and it was time to finish the design. He knew exactly where the last piece of the puzzle lay, and it wasn't in a London solicitor's office. It was in the hands of someone who had simply wanted to protect a memory from being turned into a commodity. The Highland wind let out a final, mournful whistle as he stepped into the warmth of the hotel once more, the door closing on the mist and the secrets of the old croft, leaving the mystery to be solved in the quiet corners where the tea was brewed and the real gossip was kept. Hamish stepped through the heavy oak doors of the Tommel Castle Hotel, shaking his head like a wet spaniel. The lobby was filled with the oppressive scent of beeswax and the faint, lingering aroma of Julian Vane's expensive, floral cologne. A smell that now felt like a taunt to everyone who lived in the village. Lugs gave a half-hearted shake, sending a fine spray of Highland rain onto the polished floorboards. Hamish looked toward the lounge, where the fire was roaring, but the atmosphere was anything but cozy. DCI Blair was ensconced in a leather armchair, a large glass of whiskey in one hand and a cigar in the other, looking like a man who had conquered a small country rather than nearly arrested an innocent arthritic shepherd. His detectives, Anderson and McLean, were standing by the window, looking out at the gathering gloom with expressions of profound boredom. Blair's face was still a mottled purple, reflecting his simmering, violent Highland rage at being proven wrong earlier about Archie McLean. "Back again, Macbeth," Blair barked, his voice cutting through the quiet of the room like a rusty saw. "Come to apologize for your insolence, or have you finally realized that your place is out on the road, waving your arms at the occasional sheep? I've decided to broaden the search. We're going to do a full sweep of every croft within 10 miles. I don't care if they have arthritis or not, someone in this village knows where that diamond ring is, and I'm going to squeeze it out of them." Hamish adopted his most vacant expression, scratching behind his ear. "Och, the ring, Inspector. That's a very important piece of the puzzle, to be sure, but I was actually coming in to tell you about the button. I didn't want to mention it in front of the crowd earlier, for fear of causing a panic, you understand." Blair lowered his glass, his small, piggish eyes narrowing. "A button? What are you talking about, you ginger buffoon? What button?" "Well, you see, sir," Hamish said, leaning confidentially over the back of a sofa. "When I was taking a look at the fountain, just a quick look, mind you, as you told me not to touch anything, I found a small black button. It was caught right in the stone lip, hidden by a bit of moss. It's a very specific kind of button. It has a little crest on it. A crest that looks remarkably like the one on the hotel's staff uniforms. I've put it in my desk for the specialist." Blair snorted, though he looked slightly unsettled. "Forensics chap? Fabric matching? You're making that up, Macbeth. There's no such thing as a Glasgow fabric specialist for a single button." "You say so, sir," Hamish said with a humble shrug. "But I also found something else. A small piece of hair. It was stuck to the gold adhesive on the wallpaper. It's a very long, dark hair. Not Archie's, certainly. I've put that in a little plastic baggie next to the button. I'm sure the experts will have a field day with it. It's amazing what they can do these days with a single strand, isn't it? They can practically tell what the person had for breakfast. They arrive at dawn to start their tests." He turned away then, not waiting for Blair's reply, and headed toward the kitchen. He knew the kitchen door was slightly ajar, and that the staff were always listening. In a village like Lochdubh, a secret told to a DC Voss, a secret told to everyone within 10 minutes. As he entered the kitchen, The room went silent. Mrs. Wellington was at the stove, stirring a massive pot of stew, while Mary, the young housemaid, was nervously polishing a stack of silver trays. The air was thick with the smell of onions and anxiety in the small, warm space. "Evening, everyone," Hamish said cheerfully, ignoring the tension. "I'm just here to tell you that the station will be closed for a few hours tonight. I've got to prepare for the arrival of the specialist team in the morning. They're bringing some new chemical that makes gold leaf adhesive glow if it's touched by certain types of skin oils. It's very high-tech stuff. Apparently, the killer left a perfect set of prints right on the inside of the wallpaper wrap, and this chemical will bring them out like magic. It's a bit of a shame for the person who did it. Really. They went to such trouble to be neat, only to be undone by their own biology. I left the evidence bags on my desk to save time." Mrs. Wellington's spoon hit the side of the pot with a sharp clang. "Prints on the inside of the paper, Hamish. I thought the rain would have washed all that away." "Och, no," Hamish said, picking up a stray carrot slice and popping it into his mouth. "The adhesive creates a waterproof seal, you see. It preserves everything underneath. It is like a time capsule of the murder. Whoever did it might as well have signed their name in ink. Anyway, I'm off to get some sleep now. It is going to be a long day tomorrow, once the arrests finally start. I would not want to be in their shoes when that chemical starts glowing a very bright green." He whistled for lugs and left. He had set the bait. The button and glowing chemical were fabrications, but to a guilty mind, they were terrifying. He knew the killer couldn't risk waiting until morning. Behind the rowan trees, Hamish waited. At midnight, a shadow moved toward the station door. A key turned. The latch clicked open. Hamish rose from his hiding spot and stepped into the light. He reached the open door and pushed it. "I am sorry it had to be this way, Mary," he said. The door to the police station creaked on its hinges, a sound that in the dead of the Highland night felt as loud as a gunshot. Mary stood silhouetted against the pale, watery moonlight that managed to pierce through the thick veil of the Har. She was a small, shivering figure, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of a thick, knitted cardigan that had seen better days. Her eyes, wide and luminous with a terror that was almost heartbreaking to behold, darted around the small, cluttered room. She was looking for the desk, looking for the small plastic bags that Hamish had lied about only hours before in the warmth of the hotel kitchen. "Okay, there is no chemical, Mary," Hamish said, his voice emerging from the shadows by the stove like a soft, mournful sigh. "And I never found a button with a hotel crest. I'm afraid I'm a terrible liar when it comes to the technical side of the law. But I'm a fairly good judge of when someone is carrying a burden that's too heavy for their shoulders." Mary gasped, her entire body jerking as if she had been struck. She turned toward the sound of his voice, her face as white as a sheet of parchment. "Hamish," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. I just came to see if you needed any more wood for the fire. It's a cold night. It's past midnight, Mary, and the fire is out," Hamish replied, stepping into the dim light. Lugg stood beside him, not growling now, but watching the girl with a sad, intuitive tilt of his head. "You came for the evidence. You came to destroy the prints that don't exist, and the hair that isn't there. But the real evidence is something you can't burn. It's the way you look when Morag McLean's name is mentioned. It's the way you handled those kitchen shears, returning them to the hook, because you've spent your whole life being taught that everything must be just so." Mary's knees seemed to buckle, and she slumped into the hard wooden chair, usually reserved for drunks and rowdy tourists. A sob escaped her, a jagged, raw sound that filled the small station with the weight of years of unspoken grief. He was going to take the last of her. "Hamish," she cried, her voice rising in a frantic, desperate pitch. Morag was everything. She was the one who was going to get out, the one who had the magic in her fingers. When she went to London, we were so proud. We thought she'd be a queen. But he didn't want a queen, he wanted a slave. She took her drawings, her soul, and then he let her fall. He said she was unstable, but it was him, Hamish. He broke her. Hamish watched her, his heart heavy. He had known Morag too. He remembered a girl who could find colours in a grey sky that no one else could see. And when he came here, to her home, boasting about his new designs, "You couldn't let it happen," he prompted gently. He had her sketchbook in his room. Mary spat, her sorrow momentarily replaced by a flash of cold Highland fury. "I saw it while I was cleaning. He even written his own name over hers on the inside cover. He was going to sell her life again. I met him by the fountain. I told him I knew. I told him I'd tell the papers, tell everyone what he'd done. He just laughed. He called me a peasant girl and said no one would ever believe a chambermaid over a man of his standing. He turned his back on me to look at his reflection in the water, adjusting that ridiculous hair of his. He was so full of himself he didn't even see the shears in my hand. She looked down at her hands as if they belonged to a stranger. I didn't mean to kill him at first. I just wanted to scare him. But then he said she was mediocre. He said Morag was lucky he had even bothered to steal from her. I hit him, and he fell. His head hit the stone. The water started to turn red, and I panicked. But then I saw the wallpaper in the back of his car. It was the pattern shed designed for our mother's birthday, the one he had claimed was his masterpiece. I wanted the world to see him for what he was. A fraud. A man wrapped in lies. So you wrapped him in the very thing he had stolen, Hamish said. Needs more texture. It wasn't a joke, was it? It was a judgment. Mary nodded, the tears flowing freely now. I took the ring because I thought I'd give the money to Archie. He's got nothing left, Hamish. But I couldn't do it. I threw it into the loch on the way back. It's at the bottom now, where no one will ever find it, just like Morag. She suddenly stood up, her eyes wide and wild again. I won't go to jail, Hamish. I can't. I'll go the way she did. It's better that way. She lunged toward the door, her movement surprisingly swift for someone so small. But Hamish Macbeth, for all his deceptive laziness, was a man of the hills. He moved with the sudden, explosive speed of a mountain cat, his long arms snaking out to catch her by the wrist before she could reach the handle. Mary struggled, scratching and kicking with a desperate strength born of pure terror. But Hamish held her firmly, his grip like iron. No, Mary, he said, his voice low and commanding. There's been enough death in this glen. You've done what you thought was right for Morag, but you can't fix a tragedy by adding another one to the pile. You're coming with me. The struggle went out of her as quickly as it had begun. She collapsed against his chest, her small frame heaving with sobs. Hamish held her for a long moment, the silence of the night returning to the station. He looked out the window toward the mountains, the hair finally beginning to lift. The truth was out, but it brought no joy. He had caught a killer, but he had also broken a heart that had already been shattered. He reached for the telephone to call Strathbane, knowing that the peace of Lochdubh was about to be replaced by the cold, clinical machinery of the law. I'm sorry, Mary, he whispered into the crown of her dark hair. I'm so very sorry. He knew Blair would be delighted. She knew the papers would have their headline. But as he stood there in the dark, Hamish felt only the cold, biting wind of the Highlands, a wind that blew away the gold wallpaper and left only the bare, grey stone beneath. He reached for his handcuffs, the cold metal clicking with a finality that felt like a bell tolling for the soul of the village. The peacock was gone, but the shadows he had brought with him were here to stay. He sat her down, making a pot of tea. He would wait for the sun to rise before he handed her over. The law required an arrest, but the Highlands required a moment of quiet before the world broke back in. Drink your tea, Mary, he said. The morning will come soon enough, and then we will have to face the music, however loud DCI Blair decides to play it. But for now, there is only the silence of the glen and the memory of a girl who deserved better than a peacock's vanity. We will wait here together until the sky turns blue. We stay here in the dark. The dawn was a thin, watery affair that promised nothing but persistent Highland chill. Inside the police station, the silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional clink of a spoon as Mary stared blankly at the cold circle of the stove. Hamish Macbeth stood by the window, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floorboards. He was watching for the arrival of the inevitable roar of a petrol engine that would signal the end of the night's quiet tragedy. Lugg sat by the door, his ears twitching at sounds only a dog could hear. He waited patiently. The roar of a heavy engine finally cut through the morning mist. DCI Blair arrived like a force of nature, his face already flushed with the exertion of existence. He burst through the station door, his eyes darting around with innate hostility. She took in the sight of Mary and Hamish, and his lip curled in a sneer perfected over decades of dealing with the lower orders. What's this, Macbeth? Blair barked, his voice a jagged rasp. A sunrise tea party. I've been up since 4 organizing a dive team, and here you are, hosting a social gathering. Get moving. Hamish turned slowly, his face carefully wiped of any intelligence. He adopted a look of wide-eyed, bumbling respect. Och, Inspector. You've got a sixth sense, Hamish said, his Highland lilt thickening. I was just saying to Mary how it was your presence that did it. She couldn't sleep, knowing you were in the village, turning over every stone. She came to me an hour ago, weeping, saying she couldn't live with the pressure of your investigation. She knew it was only a matter of time before you spotted the truth about the wallpaper. Your reputation precedes you in the smallest croft. Blair paused, his ego absorbing the praise like a dry sponge. Crack under the pressure, did she? He muttered, looking at Mary with predatory interest. Well, of course. I've seen it 1,000 times. They think they can hide, but they don't count on a proper detective from Strathbane rattling the cages. So, she's confessed? She's the one who wrapped that peacock in his own vanity. I knew it wasn't that shepherd. Too much finesse for a man who looks at sheep's backsides. I was actually about to order her arrest based on a hunch I had only last evening. It was a brilliant hunch, sir, Hamish added, nodding enthusiastically. I've made sure the notes reflect that. I've written that you noticed the discrepancy in the kitchen inventory. I've also mentioned how your aggressive patrolling made her realize that escape was impossible. I've kept the paperwork very simple, sir, so it won't take you long to sign off when you get back. I thought it best to let you take her in personally. It wouldn't be right for a village constable to take the credit for a strategy that was entirely yours. The chief will be very pleased. Blair's eyes narrowed, the greed for recognition warring with his natural distrust. A medal, eh? But what about you, Macbeth? If I put this through as a joint effort, they'll be wanting to reward you too. They'll think you're wasted out here and drag you back to Strathbane to work in the CID. I would have you in my office every morning, tripping over your feet and smelling of wet peat. Is that what you want? To be promoted and given a desk next to mine? Because that is exactly what will happen if your name stays on this official report. Hamish let out a gasp of genuine horror. Ark! No, sir! I'm not built for the city. The noise and lights would be the death of me. I'm just a simple man. I'm happy here with my dog. Blair laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. Exactly. You're a peasant, Macbeth. I'll tell you what. I'll take the girl, the sketchbook, and the credit. I'll write the report showing I directed the entire operation. That way, you get to stay in your little hut, and I get the promotion I deserve. Do we have a deal, man? Think carefully. Hamish lowered his head, hiding the triumph in his hazel eyes. You're a hard man, Inspector, but a fair one. If that's the price I have to pay to stay in Lochdubh, then so be it. I'll just stay here and look after the paperwork for minor things like poaching. I won't say a word to the press. I'll tell everyone that you were the mastermind, and I was just the one who opened the door. Why? It's better that the glory goes to a man who can handle the weight of it. I'll fetch her bag for her now, sir. The ring was thrown in the loch, was it? Blair grunted, already moving toward the door to signal his men. I'll have the divers look. But it doesn't matter. The confession and the sketchbook are enough to hang her. Move it, Mary. You're going to a place where they don't care about aesthetics. And you, Macbeth, get that stove lit and clear the station. I don't want to see your face for a month. If I hear a whisper of you taking credit, I'll have you directing traffic in Glasgow before you can say poached salmon. Do I make myself clear? As Blair marched Mary out to the waiting car, his chest expanded to twice its normal size. Hamish stood in the doorway and watched them go. He saw the police cars speed away, leaving the village to return to its natural, misty state. He turned back into the station, the silence now a comforting presence. He looked at Lugs, who gave a satisfied wag of his tail. Well now, Hamish whispered, that was close. We almost had to live in a house with a doorbell, but thanks to the inspector's brilliance, we're still here. I'll make the coffee, he sighed. The exhaust fumes from the Strathbane police cars lingered in the cold, damp air, long after the taillights had vanished behind the dark, sweeping bend of the road. Hamish Macbeth stood on the threshold of the Lochdubh police station, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his heavy wool trousers, feeling the familiar, heavy weight of his own anonymity settling back over him like a comfortable moth-eaten coat that he had never intended to cast off. Inside the station, the air felt larger and considerably emptier than it had only an hour ago when the room had been filled with the stifling pressure of Mary's silent confession and Blair's boisterous, self-congratulatory noise. The two teacups still sat on the scarred wooden table, and one was completely empty, its dregs cold and dark at the bottom. The other was untouched, a silent testament to Mary's frozen state of shock and the sudden interruption of her tragic narrative. Lugs let out a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to echo through the small room and padded over to the hearth, where the last of the embers had finally turned to a fine, powdery grey ash. Hamish followed him, moving with a deliberate slowness that was no longer an act for the benefit of his superiors, but a genuine reflection of the weariness that had settled into his bones. He began the mundane task of tidying the station, a process he usually avoided with the same quiet fervor. A cat avoids a sudden bath. He washed the cups in the small, chipped ceramic sink, the rhythmic clink of porcelain against stone the only sound in the absolute quiet of the Highland morning. As he wiped down the table with a damp cloth, he thought of DC Thy Blair, who was probably already halfway to Strathbane, mentally composing the grand, heroic speech he would give to the chief constable. Blair would undoubtedly paint himself as the primary hero of the hour, the sharp-eyed and intuitive detective who had seen through the thick, rustic fog to catch a calculating and dangerous killer. Hamish didn't mind the theft of credit. In fact, he took a perverse, secret pleasure in the deception he had orchestrated. To be perceived as utterly useless and lazy was his greatest shield against the world's intrusions. Frantic world of promotions, endless paperwork, and shrieking city sirens at bay, allowing him to remain right here, a permanent part of the ancient landscape, much like the purple heather and the jagged grey granite of the peaks. By mid-morning, the news of Mary's arrest had rippled through the village of Lochdubh with the incredible speed of a silver salmon jumping a mountain weir. Hamish walked down to the village square, his uniform carefully buttoned and his cap set straight on his fiery red hair, looking for all the world like a man who had slept the deep sleep of the innocent and the blissfully uninformed. The bright yellow Lamborghini was finally being winched onto the back of a large recovery truck, its vibrant, unnatural paint a garish and loud insult to the subdued, earthy tones of the Highland morning. A small crowd had gathered to watch the final departure of the celebrity designer's ghost. Mrs. Kennedy was there, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her face set in a mask of grim satisfaction as the vehicle was hauled away toward the south. "A fancy, expensive coffin for a fancy, expensive man," she remarked dryly as Hamish approached her side. "And what's this I hear about poor Mary, Hamish? Taken away by that red-faced, shouting man from the city. Surely she didn't have it in her to do such a thing." "It's a sad business, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish replied, his voice soft and noncommittal. "A very sad business indeed. But the law has its own strange ways, even if they are not always the exact ways we would choose for ourselves." The villagers looked at him, their eyes searchingly and deep. They knew, in the intuitive way Highlanders always know, that there was a great deal more to the story than Blair's loud, official version. They knew about Morag, they knew about the missing shears, and they certainly knew about the stolen gold paper. But they also knew that Hamish had kept the peace in his own fashion, and that Mary would be treated with a measure of quiet understanding by the local magistrates that a stranger from London would never receive. He was their constable, their own particular brand of justice, and as long as he stayed in Lochdubh, they felt safe from the colder, more clinical winds of the outside world. He stopped by the hotel for a moment to return the heavy kitchen shears to Mrs. Wellington, who accepted them with a silent, heavy nod that spoke volumes more than any spoken word ever could. The hotel was already moving on from the scandal. Mr. Johnson was busily directing a young porter to scrub the stone fountain with a potent mixture of bleach and hot water, erasing the last of the blood and the golden adhesive. The Sassenach invasion was over, at least for this season. Priscilla Halberton Smythe caught his eye from the high balcony of the hotel, a faint, knowing smile touching her elegant lips before she turned back inside to her duties. She knew he had won his quiet life back, and perhaps she respected him for it, even if she could never quite bring herself to understand his lack of ambition. Hamish turned his back on the Grand Hotel and walked the short distance home to his police house. He lit the peat stove, the sweet, earthy smell of smoke rising to join the lingering mist. He made a fresh, strong pot of coffee, the aroma filling the small, cozy room with a profound sense of homecoming. Lugg settled at his feet with a contented grunt, and Hamish sank into his old armchair, a book of Gaelic poetry resting in hand. The train had finally ceased its horizontal assault, leaving the village of Lochdubh in a state of dripping, crystalline silence. It was the kind of silence that only comes to the Highlands when the last of the outsiders has retreated south, leaving the mountains and the lochs to their own ancient, brooding devices. Inside the police station, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of burning peat and the rich, dark aroma of a fresh pot of coffee. Hamish Macbeth sat in his old armchair, his long legs stretched toward the hearth, while Luggs lay curled at his feet, his paws twitching as he chased imaginary rabbits through a dreamland of purple heather. The small television in the corner, an aging set that Hamish only turned on when the weather made the radio signal too crackly to bear, was currently broadcasting the evening news from Strathbane. B.C. Vice Blair was the star of the segment, his beetroot-coloured face glowing under the studio lights as he leaned toward a microphone with the impressive confidence of a man who believed he had personally saved the British Empire from certain ruin. "It was a matter of basic police work, really," Blair was saying, his voice a gravelly bark that made Hamish wince. The local constable, a well-meaning but ultimately overwhelmed fellow, had missed the most obvious clues. But as soon as my team arrived, we implemented a sophisticated psychological strategy. We tracked the suspect's movements through the village and identified the motive in a simple case of local jealousy and theft. The diamond ring is still missing, likely lost in the depths of the loch, but the case is closed. Justice has been served, and the village of Lochdubh can sleep soundly once again, thanks to the efficiency of the Strathbane CID. Hamish reached out with his toe and clicked the television off, the screen shrinking to a tiny white dot before vanishing into darkness. He let out a long, slow sigh of relief. Blair had taken the bait, the hook, and the entire fishing line. By taking all the credit for the arrest of Mary, Blair had ensured that his own name would be the only one mentioned in the commendations. More importantly, it meant that no one in the Strathbane hierarchy would be looking to promote the useless constable of Lochdubh. The threat of a desk job in a grey city, surrounded by concrete and the relentless noise of traffic, had evaporated like the morning har. A soft knock at the door startled Lugs, who gave a single polite bark. Hamish rose and opened the door to find Archie McLean standing on the step, his old cap pulled low over his brow. He was carrying a heavy parcel wrapped in damp newspaper. Without a word, Archie stepped inside and placed the parcel on the wooden table. It was a magnificent silver salmon, fresh from the river and still smelling of the cold, clean water. "For the cat," Archie said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Hamish, his eyes filled with a depth of understanding that didn't require further explanation. He knew that Hamish had seen his crippled hands and understood the impossibility of the crime. He also knew that Hamish had protected the memory of his daughter, Morag, by allowing the truth of Vane's fraud to come to light in the only way that mattered. Archie didn't mention Mary, and neither did Hamish. The village would look after her in its own way, with letters and packages and a silent agreement that her actions, while illegal, had been born of a loyalty they all understood. "It's a fine fish, Archie," Hamish said, nodding toward the table. "I'll see that it's put to good use." Archie nodded once, touched the brim of his cap, and vanished back into the mist. Hamish spent the next hour preparing a mutton stew, a slow and methodical process that allowed his mind to settle. He chopped the carrots and potatoes with a steady hand, the rhythm of the knife on the board a soothing counterpoint to the ticking of the grandfather clock. He thought about Julian Vane and the peacocks who occasionally descended upon the Highlands. They came with their loud voices and their bright cars, thinking they could impose their own artificial order on a land that had seen centuries of tragedy and triumph. They saw the texture of the scenery, but never the texture of the people who lived within it. To Vane, Morag MacLean had been a resource to be exploited to the village. She was a daughter whose talent had been a point of communal pride. The tragedy was that it had taken a murder to restore her name, but in the Highlands, the price of justice was often paid in blood and silence. He stirred the pot, the steam rising to cloud his spectacles, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for his own small, quiet life. Later that evening, as the stars began to poke through the thinning clouds, Hamish took Lugs for a walk along the harbour. The air was sharp and clean, the scent of salt spray mingling with the smoke from a dozen village chimneys. He saw Priscilla Halberton-Smythe standing near the stone wall, her silhouette elegant against the darkening sky. She didn't speak as he approached, but she stood beside him for a long time, both of them staring out at the black expanse of the Atlantic. "Blair is a fool, Hamish," she said eventually, her voice barely a whisper. "But I suppose you already know that. She thinks he's won, but he's just the loud noise before the silence returns." Hamish watched a distant lighthouse blink on the horizon. "He's a happy man, Priscilla. And a happy man is rarely a dangerous one. He has his medals, and I have my peace. It seems a fair trade to me." She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the moonlight. "And Lochdubh," she added softly, "is lucky to have a man who understands that some secrets are better left to the loch than the ledger." She walked away then, her footsteps light on the ancient stones, leaving Hamish alone with the sea. He turned back toward his cottage, the light in the window, a warm beacon of the simple life he had fought so hard to protect. Lugs trotted beside him, his tail wagging. Inside, the stew was ready, the fire was bright, and the Highland night was finally, perfectly silent. Amen.